Hello, ambassadors and frustrated Israel travelers. I'm Dale Wells, and I welcome you to our ongoing study of the locations we had planned to visit in Israel in April of 2022. Unfortunately, our visit's been rescheduled. We don't know exactly when it'll take place, perhaps in a year. Maybe you were unable to attend class this Sunday, or maybe you weren't able to see the slides on Zoom. Maybe you just want to review the material again or share it with someone else. Whatever brings you here, welcome. If you like what you see, let me know by tapping the thumbs up link. Also, if you tap the red subscribe link below, you'll be notified whenever I post a new video to the channel. Also, if you'd like to leave a comment, feel free to do so. During the months of November and December, we considered sites in the Galilee region and up and down the Jordan River to the Dead Sea. During the month of January, as we start the year of 2022, we're going to begin looking at sites around the Dead Sea and in the Judean desert as we head toward Jerusalem. Today we look at one of the most famous sites in Jewish history, even though it's not a site that figures directly in the biblical narrative. Masada is located near the southwestern end of the Dead Sea, about 40 miles southeast of Jerusalem. The word Masada is a Hebrew word meaning fortress. And its name is fitting because Masada is an ancient fortress sitting atop a massive isolated plateau rising out of the desert to a flat top that is 1,424 feet above the Dead Sea. In spite of its elevation above the surrounding terrain, its summit is only slightly above sea level. Masada resembles a huge column with sheer cliffs on all sides, making it virtually unreachable by any enemy of its day. The area atop the plateau covers about 18 acres. The traditional site of ancient Gomorrah lies at the base of Masada along the southwestern part of the Dead Sea. The traditional site of Sodom is south of Masada, about 14 miles, near a mountain appropriately named Mount Sodom that rises 742 feet above the Dead Sea. However, recent excavations have suggested that both Sodom and Gomorrah may have actually been situated northeast rather than southwest of the Dead Sea. But that's another story for another time. Masada was one of 3 fortresses built by Herod the Great for his pleasure and protection. King Herod built Masada in about 24 BC. Even though it was located in the desert, Masada was supplied by elaborate water cisterns that were fed by diverting water from nearby mountains. It boasted a 3-level palace with swimming pools and most of the luxuries life afforded at that time. In addition to ample water storage, Masada had 15 storehouses of food containing enough food to supply 10,000 people for 10 years. In the same way that anyone familiar with Texas history knows something about the Alamo, so anyone familiar with Jewish history knows something about Masada. In 66 AD, events began to unfold in Israel that caused the Jews to rebel against Roman rule. This revolt began in Caesarea Maritima, one of the sites we visited. During the First Jewish-Roman War, in 66 to 73 AD, when the nation was in revolt, a group of Jewish zealots fled Jerusalem and occupied the fortress of Masada. The zealots were nationalistic freedom fighters who opposed Roman rule. When they took Masada, they seized its store of water and food and settled in for the duration, believing that they were invincible against the Romans. Between 66 and 70 AD, Rome overcame resistance in all the northern cities of Israel. In 70 AD, the Romans, under the command of Titus, totally destroyed Jerusalem in a bloody battle that lasted well over 4 months. In this battle, Josephus claims that over 1 million Jews lost their lives, and another 97,000 were captured and enslaved. The Romans also leveled the temple. By 72 AD, a total of 960 Jewish zealots, counting their families, occupied Masada. They were under the command of Eleazar ben Yair, a Jewish zealot. After conquering Jerusalem and most of Israel, the Romans headed south to conquer the southern strongholds around the Dead Sea region, including Masada. I found a video that kind of lays out this history, and I thought you might find it interesting.
In 73 AD, Masada, the impregnable mountain fortress in the Judean desert, stood as the final holdout against the onslaught of Rome's legions. The siege that followed would mark the final, bloody suppression of the Jewish revolt with an encounter whose awe-inspiring remains can still be seen in the desert today. Prior to the Jewish revolt, Judea was a minor Roman province under the administration of a procurator and under the overall control of the governor of Syria. The region had long been divided along ethnic, religious, and class divisions, and was made even more unstable by a Roman authority which lacked the competency or military power to impose proper order. Simply put, the region was a highly combustible powder keg waiting to go off. In 66 AD, a local riot in Caesarea morphed into an anti-tax protest which challenged Roman rule. In response, the procurator Gessius Florus responded with heavy-handed retribution, plundering southwest Jerusalem and killing 3,600 people. The revolutionary spark was lit, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. A wave of communal violence surged through the entire region, with the population of Judea splintering along its divisions. Amidst the chaos, the Jewish rebels drove the Romans from Jerusalem and eliminated garrisons throughout the province. This included the capture of the fortress at Masada by radical Sicarii rebels. The Great Jewish Revolt would last 8 years and involve the personal command of 2 future emperors, Vespasian and his son Titus. Incredible amounts of blood would be spilled in a campaign that revolved primarily around sieges. This was epitomized by the epic siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which Josephus claims killed 1.1 million people, with another 97,000 captured and enslaved. While these numbers are dismissed by historians, they do attest to the intense levels of violence accompanying the fall of the city and the revolt as a whole. While the destruction of Jerusalem ended the organized resistance of Jewish forces, the fires of revolution still burned in the fringes of Judea, where the die-hard rebels holed up in fortresses refused to surrender. When Titus set sail for Rome in 71 AD, he left the new military governor, Lucilius Bassus, to conduct mopping up operations. Bassus took command of the 10th Fretensis Legion and marched first on the garrison at Herodium, followed swiftly by Hebron. He then swung the legions around the east side of the Dead Sea to take the hill fortress of Machaerus, before returning west to destroy 3,000 rebels hiding in the forest of Jardis in the Jordan Valley. Now, only the stronghold of Masada remained. However, Bassus soon died of natural causes, and the legion returned to its new base at Jerusalem, before setting out with a new commander, Flavius Silva, in 73 AD. This force now marched south, intent on terminating the last of the Jewish resistance. Masada lies 2.4 kilometers from the Dead Sea on a barren, flat-topped limestone mountain amidst a desolate landscape. On its eastern side, the summit rises 140 meters above the desert floor, roughly half the height of the Eiffel Tower. Here, a tortuous, zigzagging trail known as the Serpent Path makes its way to the top. By comparison, the western approach is more assailable, and yet even this side towers 80 meters above the surrounding landscape, the approximate height of the Statue of Liberty. As if natural defenses weren't enough, the cleared plateau at the top was ringed with a 1,400-meter-long casemate wall standing 6 meters tall. The wall design was such that it was actually made of 2 parallel layers with a central gap that could be filled with stones or dirt during a siege. Such walls were common in antiquity, as they were cheaper and faster to construct, while also doubling as storage space. In the case of Masada, the outer wall was 1.4 meters thick, and the inner was 1 meter, making for a combined width of 4 meters. The walls were reinforced by 30 towers, spaced out for topographic and strategic reasons. These were generally 6 meters wide and 20 meters tall, with stairs leading to the top. The entire defensive structure could only be crossed at 4 points: the Snake Path Gate, the Water Gate, the Western Gate, and the Cistern Gate. As with all impregnable fortresses, the Achilles heel of any defense would be access to food and water for the defenders. However, Masada was well prepared in this respect. Cut into the rock were numerous cisterns and reservoirs. 12 were constructed in 2 rows along the northwestern slopes with a total capacity of 40,000 cubic meters or 16 Olympic pools. Buildings also dotted the top of the plateau with a series of long storehouses built into the northern complex. These could hold large quantities of corn, oil, wine, dates, and food supplies that would be preserved for long periods of time due to the naturally dry climate. Even if stockpiles began to run low, the open plateau area might be used to grow additional food. It's safe to say that a defensive force could expect to hold out indefinitely against just about any attacker. Unfortunately for the Jews, the Roman army wasn't your average foe. In fact, the Roman force bearing down on Masada had at its core the 10th Fretensis Legion. This unit of 4,800 men was a descendant of Julius Caesar's famed 10th Legion and was adorned with numerous battle honors. Recently, it had been blooded by campaigns in Armenia and was battle-hardened by the siege of Jerusalem. This grizzled legion was joined by 6 auxiliary cohorts and thousands of Jewish prisoners of war. In total, Silva arrived at Masada with a force of nearly 10,000. Bunkered atop the fortress, looking down on the incoming troops, would be a defensive garrison of less than 1,000. Even this number is inflated since a large part of Masada's occupants were actually refugees. These women and children were certainly not dead weight, and could have helped with defensive operations under the guidance of the Jewish commander Eleazar ben Yair. Eleazar was an important figure in the Jewish revolt and was one of the principal leaders of the Sicarii, who now made up the main fighting force at Masada. These troops were a splinter group of the Hebrew Zealots, and whose name means literally dagger men. They were fierce resistance forces, made famous for being one of the earliest organized assassination units that would strike their targets in public gatherings before disappearing into the crowd. Such zealots had successfully held the Romans at bay and even defeated them in the past, despite being poorly equipped, and were not to be underestimated. When the Romans arrived in the autumn of 73 AD, they had no illusions that the siege would be over quickly. With this understanding, they set up camp on the western approach, and went about securing their own position whilst undermining the defenders. First, the Romans targeted the aqueducts serving the fortress and diverted them for their own use. Next, they set to work constructing a wall of circumvallation. This was a textbook Roman operation meant to encircle enemy positions. The fortification would ensure that defenders were cut off from the outside world and help thwart attempts at a breakout. During the siege of Jerusalem, Titus had failed to construct such a wall from the get-go and was harassed mercilessly by Jewish sorties. Silva was determined not to make the same mistake and put his men to work immediately. Using pickaxes and entrenching tools, the Romans quarried local stones and erected a 3-meter wall which ran 3.2 kilometers. This was reinforced by 8 camps and numerous guard posts. In addition, a string of towers helped shore up defenses on the more exposed eastern valley. This impressive network was built in a matter of days and can be clearly seen in the desert today. Silva established his headquarters on the higher ground to the west, along with legionary cohorts 1 through 5, while cohorts 6 through 10 took residence on the low ground to the east. The remainder of the auxiliary forces were then stationed in the surrounding minor camps, thus ensuring that troops completely surrounded the fortress. Now that the attackers had their prey cornered, it was time to close in for the kill. The Romans decided that taking the fortress by force would be necessary, since their own supplies would run out long before those of the defenders. But the question still remained of how best to assault a mountaintop. A quick storming of the walls with ladders was out of the question, since any attack would be forced to advance at a dangerously slow pace and would be funneled through narrow killing fields. In this scenario, the defenders would be at a huge advantage, and any outcome would be Pyrrhic at best. Typically, Roman forces would overcome such adversity by using siege equipment to offer protection from projectiles, whilst artillery suppressed the defenders. However, the terrain at Masada was far too steep for siege equipment and too high for artillery. It would therefore be necessary to not only overcome the defenders, but nature itself. Ultimately, the Romans decided to turn the rocky cliffside into a gradual highway for an assault. To do this, the engineers would build an enormous siege ramp by taking advantage of a natural spur called the White Rock on the western side of the mountain. The plan was to bridge the existing gulf up to the walls with the man-made 20-degree incline. To support a ramp of this scale, the base had to be huge, so as not to collapse under its own weight, and was started roughly 200 meters out from the cliff. Here, the 10th Fretensis took the lead in construction while Jewish prisoners were used to bring a continual stream of water and supplies to the camps. Day in and day out, they slowly added more and more material to the foundation. At first, the volume being added would do little to increase the height of the ramp, but as the days, weeks, and months rolled by, it only grew faster and faster. The sheer audacity of the construction project must have awed the defenders, who woke up every morning to a mountain slowly rising towards their walls. However, as the ramp got closer and closer, it meant that workers were more and more vulnerable to projectiles launched from the walls and towers above. In response, the Romans surely would have begun to erect temporary walls and sheds to cover their progress. Additional archers and artillery may also have been called up to provide covering fire for the work crews and to dissuade counterattacks. Within 2 months, the ramp to the fortress was complete. It measured 220 meters wide at its base, rose 90 meters, and was topped with a 20-meter stone pier nearest the wall. According to archaeologists, this obscenely large amount of earthwork weighed the equivalent of 1.5 times the Empire State Building. It is stunning to imagine that this was accomplished without the use of modern equipment. Now, a 25-meter siege tower was constructed and slowly rolled up the ramp. It was specifically designed to handle the angled slope and included a battering ram at the front. The tower likely also carried small artillery pieces which could be used to shoot down at the enemy walls which it now overlooked. It is important to note that this was often the primary purpose of siege towers. Rather than being glorified elevators for infantry assaults, they were actually meant to provide elevated positions for sniping at defenders and forcing them away from the walls while a larger breach was formed. In the case of Masada, the siege tower guarded the battering ram, which started to break down the walls. In response, the defenders set about reinforcing their defenses. When the Roman ram broke through the main wall, the attackers were faced with a second, hastily erected wall made of alternating layers of wood and earth. This wall proved far more resilient to the battering ram, seemingly absorbing every blow. It was, however, flammable, and so the Romans set fire to the timbers. Though the flames caught on, the wind changed direction and blew the flames back onto the siege tower, setting it alight. The attackers now faced the devastating prospect of having their equipment destroyed without having set foot within the fortress. Fortunes once again shifted, however, and the wind reversed direction, concentrating the fire back onto the inner wall. By nightfall, the defenses were sufficiently weakened, and the legionaries made preparations for a full-force assault the next day. As the sun rose over Masada on the 3rd of May, the 10th Fretensis Legion stormed through the wall and burst out onto the plateau. Rather than being met by screams and shouts, however, they faced a deafening silence. The complex was filled with bodies of dead Jews. According to the historian Josephus, the defenders had accepted the inevitability of their fate and chosen death rather than capture. The grisly details of this mass suicide were apparently recounted by the handful of women and children who evaded the slaughter. More recent historical findings, however, have found discrepancies with Josephus' story and cast doubt on the final fate of the defenders. Nonetheless, the symbolism of a heroic Jewish last stand against oppressors lives on to this day and is a point of pride for the Israeli Defense Force recruits who take a vow never to let Masada fall again. The fall of Masada in 73 AD brought an end to the Great Jewish Revolt, which had raged on for 8 years. The land of Judea now became an independent Roman province under the administration of its own governor. However, the overwhelming use of force did little to quell the tensions which permeated the region. In the following years, the Jews would rise up twice more, only to be beaten mercilessly into submission with immense casualties. According to Cassius Dio, 50 of the most important Jewish strongholds and 985 of the better-known villages were razed to the ground. Teaching the Torah was forbidden, and the province was renamed Syria Palestrina. This effectively marked the beginning of the diaspora and extinguished the idea of a Jewish state for the next 1800 years. Throughout the struggle, and especially at Masada, we were confronted with feelings of both great awe and sadness. The feats of engineering displayed by the Romans undeniably capture our imagination, and yet at the same time ring hollow in our hearts given the ultimately destructive purpose of these engines. For me, the siege of Masada and its 2,000-year-old remains are a striking testament to the lengths our species will go to kill one another. As an admirer of the Roman war machine, this is a particularly important reminder of the field of corpses it left behind. Personal human tragedies rarely shine through the fog of history, and we would do well not to forget them. After all, one day, we will find ourselves in such books.
So what will we see when we finally get to Masada? Well, here's a view of Masada and the Dead Sea from the northwest. Masada is situated opposite what's called the Lysan Peninsula. Lysan is an Arabic word for tongue, and that is an important point because it's a possible place where enemies might cross over the Dead Sea to invade Israel. In fact, they had done so in the past in the days of Jehoshaphat. But as you sit on top of Masada, you can look across the Dead Sea to the mountains of Moab, the Lysan Peninsula, and even the southern end of the Dead Sea. The shape of the mountain reminds some people of the shape of a ship, and as a result of faulting and wadi drainage, the whole fortress stands alone as a kind of an isolated tooth of rock sitting across from that Lysan Peninsula above the Dead Sea. The king's private villa enjoyed a view as spectacular as any villa anywhere in the Roman world, including looking north up the Rift Valley, east to the Dead Sea, west to the Judean desert. Masada has been explored extensively since the early 1800s. Josephus and archaeology are really the only two sources that we have of information, though, about Masada's history and where it figures into the narrative that we follow in the Bible. The summit of Masada sits 190 feet above sea level and about 1,500 feet above the level of the Dead Sea. The mountain itself is 1,950 feet long, 650 feet wide, and 4,250 feet in circumference, encompassing about 23 acres. The climb up the Snake Path is 900 feet in elevation. The increase in elevation on the siege ramp on the western side, though, is only 225 feet. In this view, you can see some of the Roman siege camps, the siege wall that was built to isolate Masada as the Romans decided to work on their onslaught against the fortress. Even today, the Armored Corps of the Israel Defense Forces bring new recruits to Masada for their swearing-in ceremony, where they undertake the promise that Masada shall not fall again. Here's a view of the Masada Roman siege camps on the east side as you look down upon them from above. And here's a view of Masada from the east. Things that have been found at Masada, they include isolated potsherds or pottery fragments that date as far back as the 10th century BC, which would be the time of David. They found 50 coins from the time of Alexander Jannaeus, which would be in the Hasmonean period between the Testaments. And they found a lot of stuff that dates back to Herod's occupation and Herod's successors, as well as remains of everyday life and things that existed during the time that the area was occupied prior to its fall. Here's a view of the Masada from the south. It's possible that David hid out here when he was on the run from Saul. Scripture mentions on a few occasions that David found refuge in what's called the stronghold. I'd always wondered what the stronghold was. And then I found out the word for stronghold in Hebrew is Masuda. And so when I come to a place like 1 Samuel 22 verses 4 and 5, and I read about how David and 400 of his men hid from Saul at the stronghold, the Masuda, I think perhaps this is where he's talking about. As a matter of fact, it makes a lot of sense when you get to 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 22. What's happened just before that is that David has spared Saul's life at En-Gedi, which is just a very short distance away from here, and then David and his men go up to the stronghold. So I think it's entirely likely that as far back as David, Masada was being used as a stronghold to prevent attack by enemies. Certainly during the period between the Testaments, the Hasmoneans occupied this during the Maccabean revolt and thereafter. Jonathan the high priest, who was the brother of Judas Maccabeus, built a fortress here in the 2nd century BC, and it was occupied by Alexander Jannaeus to protect his southeast border during the Hasmonean dynasty. Herod the Great fortified Masada between 36 and 30 BC. Why would he fortify such an isolated place out in the desert? Well, there are three possibilities. One is that Masada was a good place to escape in the event of a Jewish uprising, attempting to put an Hasmonean on the throne. And that was something that Herod was particularly concerned about. Herod was very paranoid. In fact, if there was any indication of any kind of an uprising, he put it down with great ruthlessness. And so it certainly is reasonable to think that perhaps along with his palace at Herodium and his palace at Machaerus, that he built Masada as a place where he could escape. Also, Herod might have been apprehensive about Cleopatra in Egypt, and this provided a good fort to protect him against an invasion from the Egyptians. Masada also was located opposite that Lycaon peninsula. Lycaon is a word that means tongue, and it describes a place where the Dead Sea narrows, which could allow for a crossing by enemies. Well, Josephus records that Herod brought his family to Masada during the battle against the last of the Hasmoneans and during the invasion of the Parthians. While Herod traveled to Rome to be appointed king and to get an army, his family came very close to dying from a lack of water. They were saved, however, in a sudden torrential downpour that filled up Masada's cisterns that I'll show you shortly. Archelaus took Masada when his father died, but after 10 years he was deposed by Rome, and Roman soldiers were stationed at Masada after 6 AD. Here you can see the remains of the Roman siege camps on two of the sides, but you can also get an overview of that snake path which was the way into the city. In 66 AD, Menahem ben Yehuda, the leader of the Sicarii, they were called the Sicarii because that's the word for dagger that they carried in their robes. The Sicarii was a bunch of assassins. They were the most extreme zealots. They captured Masada from the Roman garrison, and Menahem was then later killed by his opponents in Jerusalem. But the refugees occupied Masada and reused Herod's building materials. Well, in 70 AD, the Sicarii were joined by some Jews escaping from Jerusalem. About 967 people total sought refuge under Menahem's nephew Eleazar ben Yair. And between 70 and 73 AD, the Jews of Masada made raids on Roman forces. In 72, the Roman procurator, Governor Silva, set out to destroy Masada. He marched with the Roman 10th Legion along with thousands of Jewish prisoners whom he could use as laborers. As the Romans constructed a siege ramp, the defenders built a wall behind the casemate wall. Now, you may remember from our earlier studies, a casemate wall is basically a two-level wall with an inner wall and an outer wall separated by rooms that could be used for storage or could be used to reinforce the wall in the event of a siege. It had a wooden frame. It was filled with earth so it could withstand a battering ram. On the eve of Passover in 73 A.D., the Romans set the wall on fire, but the wind changed directions and began coming at the Romans before shifting directions again. The Romans decided to wait until the morning before entering the compound. Eleazar called the Jews together. He gave two speeches according to Josephus. The first was a philosophical speech, and it failed, but the second was a pragmatic attempt. It told what horrors were going to await the Jews if they were allowed themselves to be captured by the Romans. He told the men to go home, destroy their valuables, slit the throats of their families, and then come back. 10 men were then chosen to kill all the rest of the men. 1 man then was selected to kill the other 9, and the last man was to set fire to the main buildings so the Romans couldn't use them, and then commit suicide. Only 2 women and 5 children hid themselves and told the soldiers of this event the next day. It's possible that Josephus interviewed them, and that's where he got his information. After 73 A.D., the site was abandoned until the 5th century, when it was inhabited by monks who built a church at the site. Those Byzantine monks adapted a few caves as dwelling places, and they built cells in a number of places in or near the ruined buildings, and they stayed for more than 100 years. Here's a view of Masada from the southwest, where you can see the Roman siege ramp, the Byzantine church. You can see Herod's 2 palaces, his northern palace where he lived and his western palace, which was kind of the ceremonial palace, as well as the casemate wall and the storehouses and a Roman tower. Here's a view of Masada again from the north. This is a view of the snake path. You can see people walking up that snake path. Those who are less inclined to climb can ride the cable car that has been installed there since 2001. The elevation gain is about 900 feet, and the route is about 2,880 feet in length. And here's the way the snake path looks from below, and the way it looks from above. Now, the natural route up the hill on the eastern side is called the snake path, and the Romans wouldn't be able to invade on that kind of precipitous trail. So what they did is they built a siege ramp on the western side. That ramp was built while siege engines and armored men protected the workers. Here's a closer view of that Roman siege ramp, and an even closer view of that 20-degree grade up the ramp that was built in a matter of a couple of months. Here's a side view of the siege ramp, and a view over its shoulder of the main siege camp from the south. And here's a closer view, and you can see the big square siege camp over the shoulder of the siege ramp. Here's what the defenders of Masada would have been looking at. This is the Roman siege ramp looking down from above. And here are 2 of the siege camps located right at the siege ramp. Here's the main siege camp of the Romans. An estimated 9,000 soldiers plus support and slaves conducted the siege. The total number in the 8 Roman camps likely totaled 15,000. And here's a closer view of a Roman siege wall and camp. The wall was built to keep the defenders from escaping between the camps. They were about 6 feet thick and 7 miles long. Its purpose was to hem the defenders in. Here's a reconstructed Roman siege camp that we'll be able to see when we get to visit the site. And here's a reconstructed part of the Roman siege wall. This is a catapult that would have been used to lob large balls over the walls and into the walls in order to try to bombard the area that was being besieged. But unfortunately, that kind of backfired on the Romans, because the catapult balls then became objects that the Jewish defenders could throw down on the Romans. In fact, some of these stones have been found in the excavations. Finally, this is the base of a siege engine that's been reconstructed, that was rolled up to the very top, and from which the defenders would be attacked from above. On top of Masada, there is an ancient lime kiln where pockets of limestone were processed. I told you before that Herod the Great was a great builder, and the water system at Masada is a great example of that. The water system was based on two natural factors: the flood waters from the wadis below and the rocky spur that links Masada to the desert in the west. Herod had two channels constructed and leading to 12 giant cisterns, basically caves in the western side of the wall on two levels. If you look at this model, it looks like those two channels run uphill, but actually they run at a slightly downward grade. And as they flow down those two channels, the water would fill 12 cisterns up with about 14.4 million gallons of water. In fact, the drainage was such that those 12 cisterns could be filled in about 2 hours from runoff water from the wadis. Here's a view of the cisterns. You can see the upper level and the lower level cistern. And here's a closer view of some of the cisterns. This is the aqueduct that leads down from the wadis to the Masada to fill those rows of cisterns. And this gives you an idea of what size those cisterns are. You see the two men standing down in the corner? Those cisterns could hold 1.4 million cubic feet of water. Here's the northern palace, which was where Herod lived, and some of the buildings around it: the bathhouse, the storehouses, the Roman tower, and the Jewish synagogue. Most of what was inhabited in Masada was at the northern end of the area. The northern palace was a private villa with an immense view. The western palace was the royal residence that was used for ceremonies and audiences. The top level of the northern palace is semicircular. The middle level is circular, and the bottom level is rectangular. The middle level is about 40 feet above the lowest level, which is about 110 feet below the highest level. Here's the way the palace would have looked when it was built. As you look at the northern end of Masada, you can see where the northern palace is. You can see where the siege ramp comes up on the west side. You can see the Lycon across the Dead Sea, and you can see those two rows of cisterns that Herod had built. They found at the lower level of Herod's palace the remains of a man, a woman, and a child, dating back to those Jews that committed suicide in 73 AD. Here in the northern palace is Herod's bedroom. When was the last time you were ever in the bedroom of a king? The middle level of the palace was a circular terrace that was designed as a pavilion for personal enjoyment. The lower level was a courtyard surrounded by 2 rows of columns separated by pillars. A huge supporting wall was built by Herod to strengthen the lower terrace. There was a bathhouse on the lower terrace, a cold water pool, a warm room, and a hot room. And on the steps leading to the cold water pool, the remains of 3 skeletons were discovered. A 20-year-old man, and next to him some armor pieces, arrows, fragments of a prayer shawl, and a piece of potsherd. that was written on in Aramaic. Also on the steps was a skeleton of a young woman whose scalp was preserved and intact. The third skeleton was a child. This is Herod's northern palace, the lower level. And another view of the restored area of Herod's northern palace. As you look at Herod's palace, you can see the three levels of the northern palace. You can see the cisterns, the bathhouse, the storehouses, the quarry, the Roman tower, the synagogue, and the wall that was surrounding the entire fortress. Here's a view of the northern end of Masada from the west. And here's the bathhouse from the northeast. The bathhouse was built in accordance with all the requirements of the Roman bathing cult. It was decorated with wall and ceiling frescoes and a patterned floor tiling. Herod had private baths in each of his 2 residences, but this was typical of the Roman way of life. The main purpose of the baths was for social gatherings. Blatant luxuries like baths and swimming pools indicate a very high standard of living. What a large contrast there is between the desert life and Herod's water park. The large courtyard was used for lectures, readings, and adult education. The first ancient mikveh identified in Israel was actually found here at Masada. And since it was first identified, over 900 mikvahs have been discovered throughout the country. Here's a second mikveh that was found at Masada. As I told you before, when we took a look at Beth Shan and the bathhouse there, the bathhouse was constructed in several parts. And here's a good example. The apoditarium is a place where it was a dressing room for people to change into their clothes for exercise and for bath. From that room, they would move to the tepidarium, which was the room that was used for exercise. And from there, they would move into the bathhouse calidarium, the hot room. This was the main room of the bath. The calidarium pictured here had a heavy floor suspended on 200 pillars. Outside the room, a furnace sent hot air under the floor. When water was placed on the floor, steam was created. Pipes were built into the walls to help heat the room. The room had a vaulted ceiling so that water condensation wouldn't drip on the bather. Here's a brief reconstruction of the bathhouse floor as it would have sat on top of those limestone pillars. And here's the curved calidarium roof that would keep condensation from dripping down on you when you were using that calidarium. Here's the furnace for the calidarium where the fire was kept stoked in order to send the heated air under those pillars. And here's the outlets where the heat would go into the calidarium room. After spending some time in the calidarium, a person would leave and go to the frigidarium where they would take a dip in a cold pool to end their bath. Not far from the northern palace are 15 long storerooms that were essential for storing provisions during times of siege. Herod had them filled with supplies, including food and weapons, and each storeroom held a different commodity. This was attested by the different storage jars and inscriptions on the jars that were found in the rooms. The excavators found wine bottles that had been sent to Herod from Italy. The excavators restored some of the storehouses using the stones that had collapsed over the centuries. Other storehouses were left as they were found. This is the room where lots were found. Do you recall how I told you that Josephus tells the story about all of the men being sent home to kill their families, then reassembled, and then 10 men were selected to kill the rest, and then 1 was selected to kill the other 9. Well, this is where they found the lots that were used apparently in that procedure. Here's a Roman tower that was a part of a defensive mechanism. This is a quarry that was used by the builders of the site in Herod's day for extracting hard dolomite. Stone extracted from the cisterns on the site was also used as building material. Just outside of the northern palace was the commandant's residence, which provided a barrier between Herod and the people. And here are the buildings south of the Roman Tower. This area in Masada was not all utilized to the same degree. Most of the buildings were constructed on the northern half, leaving the southern half to be used for agriculture. According to Josephus, dirt was brought to the top of the fortress and trees and vegetables were cultivated there. Here's a picture of the synagogue from the east. The synagogue was found in the first season of excavations, and it exists back in the time of the Second Temple period. In other words, the time before the destruction of Jerusalem. The benches were made out of dressed stone. There are column drums and capitals that were taken from the Herodian buildings. So it's apparently a Herodian-dated structure that we're looking at here. The synagogue had a large hall and the roof was supported by pillars. There was a back room that served as a geniza that I'll show you in a moment, and a cistern was built to the north. Here's a better view of the reconstructed synagogue. And here's a view of the geniza, which is basically a closet that was used for the storage of religious books and writings. Here is a room called the Casemate of the Scrolls. And archaeologists found scroll fragments and papyrus sheets, and they found money and sandals and textiles and glass vessels and all kinds of things here when they were excavating it. They even found items that dated back to the Roman invaders after the fall of Masada. In fact, among the scrolls discovered in this room were things like fragments of Genesis, Leviticus, and Psalms, as well as a number of non-biblical works, and a pay stub for one of the Roman soldiers that dates back to 72 AD, which would be during the time of the siege of Masada. That particular document looks an awful lot like pay stubs we might see today. It lists debits from the salary because of monetary withdrawals and purchases that had been made against the soldier's salary that he was expecting to come in. So, if, for example, this fellow named Gaius had purchased food for 20 denarii and barley for his horse for 16 denarii, he'd bought a linen tunic that cost him 7 denarii and sandals for 5 denarii. And all of those things were deducted from his monthly pay. 3 rooms remain of a Byzantine church that was built in the 4th and 5th centuries. And that church has some beautiful mosaic floors, as well as a menorah pattern on the wall. Here's a look at Herod's western palace, the ceremonial palace. It was a self-contained unit with storerooms, cisterns, and an audience room, and it covered more than 34,000 square feet. The western wing included storerooms, a kitchen, 2 courtyards, and a system of cisterns. And the northern wing was built around an enormous courtyard and included servant quarters and a pottery kiln. The southern wing included a waiting room, a water pit, and a dining hall. The dining hall was equipped like any of the Greco-Roman dining halls of the wealthy people of that day. Here's the entrance into the Western Palace. And here's one of the beautiful mosaic floors found in that Western Palace. And another. And another. Here's another mosaic floor that belongs to a room that has a bath that I'll show you in the next slide. And here's that room in the Western Palace with a bath. Masada had everything that a Roman city could offer in its day, even though it was situated out in this remote area near the Dead Sea. It had a large swimming pool. It had a lot of dwelling places. It had a place for studying scriptures. That's what a bet midrash is. A room with benches and a central table that was a house of Torah study. And in the days before cell phones, it even had a columbarium. What is a columbarium, you may ask? Well, This is a room that was built in the Herodian period for the purpose of raising homing pigeons. And so Herod could send messages to Jerusalem or to Herodium or to Machaerus by sending those notes attached to the legs of these homing pigeons. They would fly to the place they were designated to go to, and then they would return to here. Here's the southern cistern on the top of Masada. I mentioned that there were 12 cisterns carved into the bottom of the mountain, and those cisterns filled naturally by the channels that Herod had built, the aqueducts, to take the runoff water. But how did they get the water from down there to the top? Well, they did that by having slaves who did nothing all day, every day, except go up and down the hill with buckets of water. And here's the southern cistern steps leading into that cistern. Here's the cistern from the base of the steps. And here's the cistern from the other side looking back toward the steps. Here was the large swimming pool for the people, not Herod himself, but the people who populated the area. And here's a view of Masada to the east. Well, that's our view of Masada as we look at a sunrise over the Dead Sea. I hope that that's been of interest to you, and I left you with a few thoughts to ponder. Question 1. The Jewish nation as a whole and their leaders rejected Jesus as their Messiah. As a result, Jesus pronounced judgment upon the nation in Luke 19:41-44. Can you think of other nations that have fallen because they've opted for nationalistic pride over allegiance to God's will? Is there a message in this for us? Well, here's the event from Luke 19. As Jesus drew near, he saw the city. He wept over it, saying, "Would that you, even you, had known on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation." Well, that's what Jesus said to Jerusalem. And it happened exactly as he said in 70 AD. And it happened again at this place, Masada. And so we have to ask ourselves the questions. Can it ever be that we become so loyal to our nationalistic pride that it becomes more important to us than our allegiance to God? It's happened in the past. Could it happen again? A second question I asked you. The decline and fall of many nations can be traced to the decisions of its leaders and the prevailing attitudes of its people. Even though there may be many righteous people in a country, God may still judge it because of the sinful and immoral decisions of its leaders and the majority of its population. Is there a warning for those of us who live in the United States in the 21st century? And then, looking at it from the standpoint of those who are lamenting the state of our society, the sad reality is that the righteous often suffer at the hands of the wicked. Are there any messages we can learn from that unfortunate reality? I hope you'll give some thought to those questions. That ends our study of Masada. I hope that you'll be able to join us for our next study, whether you meet us in the church building or whether you meet us online. Next week, we'll talk about one of my favorite places, En Gedi. In the meantime, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.